Hi, I'm Mattea Roach. Welcome to Bookends. Are you someone who's prone to what-if thoughts? What if I forgot to lock the door? What if my elevator in my condo building breaks down? What if I saw something that I wasn't supposed to see? What would I do? If you're someone who's prone to anxiety, these trains of thought can be quite consuming. Linwood Barclay has built his career ratcheting up life's what-ifs. It's the question that underpins all of his intricate thrillers where relatable people have to find their way out of some very bad situations. Linwood is one of Canada's most successful living writers. His 20-plus books have sold millions of copies worldwide. Stephen King is among his fans. Stephen King's called Linwood a master of suspense. And Margaret Lawrence and the mystery novelist Ross MacDonald were his mentors. Linwood began his professional writing career as a reporter in Peterborough and then became a humor columnist for the Toronto Star, and eventually hit it big with thriller novels. His latest book comes out in May, and it's called Whistle. And that's not all. Linwood is also a panelist on Canada Reads 2025, championing Jenny's Boy by Wayne Johnston. Across his works, Linwood Barclay is known for exhilarating plot twists that challenge perceptions, explore moral dilemmas, and delve into the darker side of human nature. And I'm so pleased to have Linwood in our studio in Toronto today. Hi, how are you doing?
It's great, and it's lovely to be here. That sounded really good.
We like to promote and sing the praises of our guests a little bit on the show. You're here for a reason.
Well, thank you so much.
You've published so many books, bestsellers, wide range of ideas. Do you ever sit down to write and think this might be the day that the well runs dry, or is it just a fountain for you?
Oh, no, that's always a fear. It hits me most, I think, when I actually finish writing a book and you get you're a bit exhausted and you think, I don't know if I can do this again. But then you do. You start to get bored and you get restless and you have an idea and you think, well, I've got to do something. And so you start another one. And I have been there. I think, well, can I do this again? And usually it's my wife who'll sort of say, of course you can, because you've already done 25 of them. I mean, how hard can it be, really? And so, yeah, something comes together and you sit down, you start working again.
How do you know when you've hit on an idea that's going to work for a novel?
That's a good question, because I always figure that the beginning of every book has a hook. It has something that happens that surprises or, grabs the reader by the lapels and they feel compelled to go on. And sometimes you think of a really sort of a neat hook, a neat situation. But then you think, yeah, but can I spin that out into 100,000 words? Is there enough there? Because it's really like what you need to do is you have to think, well, what happened before this hook happened? And are the events that culminated in this, is there enough there? So I'll have to think about that. And I won't start writing until I'm confident that this is a hook that can do that. I mean, I had an idea for a novel a few years ago about a woman who comes home, and it would seem that she's only been gone from her house long enough to go shopping for some groceries. And when she comes back, there's a different house on her lot than there was when she left. And so what really happened? Did she have amnesia? Was it, like all these sort of different kind of scenarios. But I just loved the hook so much, but I couldn't figure out why that happened. And so I tucked it away in the back of my head. And then like maybe 2-3 years later, I said, let's figure this out. And I just sat down and I wrote up like 12 possibilities of how this could have happened, including alien abduction, which isn't the kind of book I do or at the time. So, and I came up with something. So then I thought, yeah, I can make this work.
Okay. You've said that most of your ideas come from what you call everyday anxieties, but then we're also talking about, a woman coming home and a different house is on her lot than was there when she left. Are you generally an anxious person, would you say? Like, why is this the territory that you choose to write in?
To answer the first part, yes. Anxious, yes. I think I must be the glass is half empty person as opposed to the glass is half full. And I am, I think, an anxious person, and I try to keep that tamped down and keep it in check. But I suppose maybe it's a mixed blessing, because out of those anxieties grows these books, because I'm the kind of person who will look at, well, what could go wrong in the following situation? What if we get the wrong mail to the house? How could that be the sort of first domino in something terrible happening? So I am that kind of person, but it's so far served me well.
The first fiction that you ever published centered around this character, Zach Walker, who's a
Yes.
sci-fi writer turned newspaper writer and is also a sort of perpetually worried kind of guy. And you described him at the time as this anxiety-ridden and anal-retentive, also know-it-all, pain in the neck, like an
Yes.
elevated, almost you described version of yourself.
I don't think I used the word neck, but you are very correct.
Yeah. Well, this is public radio. What inspired the first novel? Because that was then a series, the Zach Walker series.
That's right. That book came out of my wife, Neith, and I were just out doing the grocery shopping. And she has a habit of leaving her purse in the little spot where it's like a kid's seat in the grocery cart. And then we'll wander down the aisle to pick up something and grab it and come back. And the purse just sits there. And sometimes it's even open so you can sort of see the wallet inside. And so at one time I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if I were to just take my wife's purse and throw it out in the car, and then she would think that it had been stolen, and then she would realize that it's unwise to leave your purse exposed that way. And I decided not to do that because I wanted to live. Mm-hmm. But I thought, what if I were just enough of a jerk that I did do that? And what if the cart that I happened to walk by and the purse that I happened to see actually wasn't my wife's cart and my wife's purse, and I took it? Mm. And that's how the first Zach Walker novel got going. That was Bad Move. And so it all grew out of that one moment. And in fact, when I started writing it, the first chapter was that incident in the grocery store where he takes the wrong purse. And I wrote about 100 pages of it. And then I realized, no, that's the middle of a book because I have to establish a pattern of behavior by Zach, that he's this sort of meddlesome, anxiety-riddled person who likes to set up demonstrations to teach his family how to behave more, safely.
Teach lessons, yeah.
Teach lessons, instruct. They'll thank me. I know they will afterwards. And so I thought, I have to write a book that establishes that pattern of behavior with other incidents until we get to that pivotal moment. And that's when all hell starts to break loose.
Now, when you published Bad Move, you were a humor columnist for the Toronto Star. You'd been writing for a long time professionally, not so much writing fiction professionally, though, but you'd been writing stories since you were a kid, from what I understand, and had always been quite prolific. What sparked your love of writing in the first place?
That's a good question. And even at the Star, when I was hired at the Star, I'd been a reporter for 4 years at two smaller papers, one of them Two-Bird Examiner. And when I was hired at the Star, I was hired as an editor, and I was an editor there for 13 years before I got the column writing gig. So there was a long gap where I didn't do any writing. And then the column gig I started in 93. But I started writing stories probably in grade 5 or 6. I was probably 11 or 12. And I would love to say that I was inspired by Hemingway or Shakespeare or whatever, but I was a kid of the 60s who was obsessed with television. And there was a spy show on at the time called The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which I was completely obsessed with. And an episode a week wasn't enough for me. So I started writing what we would today call fan fiction. And I would sit down and I got my dad to teach me how to type because it took too long to handwrite these things. And I would start writing when I was in grade 6, grade 7. 25, 30-page type novellas based on characters from a TV show that were invented by somebody else.
Your dad, it seems like, has been a big influence on you, and you seem to have been very close with him. I know he passed away when you were quite young.
Yeah.
What kind of influence did he have on you?
Well, he was always encouraging. I mean, he was creative in his own way. He was an artist. He was actually a commercial illustrator and worked in advertising. If you were to leaf through the pages of Life, Look magazine, in the 50s or whatever, and you would see all these advertisements for cars, and all the cars were illustrated as opposed to photography. And my dad drew those cars. So he was a very talented guy. And he was a kid at heart, too. I mean, he loved model cars and trains and slot cars and all that kind of stuff. And in his own way was encouraging of anything that I wanted to do. So, I mean, we had this old Royal typewriter, a manual that I like to say weighed about the same as a Volkswagen. And the lesson was quite simple. He just said, here's where your fingers rest. This finger hits this key. This finger hits that key. That's how that works. And then, use your thumbs to space. That's how you do it. Mm. And so whatever habits I learned when I was in grade 6, I still have, and I still can't do the number key without looking.
Wow. You write about your father and you're kind of coming of age around the time that he passed away, because I know you were a teenager. You were growing up at the time that your dad passed at this fishing camp that your parents had bought, and you write about this in your memoir, Last Resort. How did you end up living on this fishing camp when your father had been a commercial artist?
So my dad was kind of a modern-day blacksmith in that he was very good at something that no one wanted anymore. So he could do these beautiful, magnificent airbrushed drawings of automobiles, but as the 60s progressed, photography killed what he did. He used to say that partly that was the car started to look so good you didn't have to cheat with artwork to stretch them out and so forth. And so he was reduced to doing much sort of menial work. He was working at an advertising studio and he was doing retouching on photographs and he was doing other stuff that was meaningless to him. And my mother had a lifelong sort of obsession with travel trailers. She thought they were just the greatest way to travel. And as a kid, for me, it was a nightmare because you're a little guy sitting in the back of a car and you're not tall enough to see out the window. So it's like 6 hours a day of looking at red vinyl upholstery and that's all there is. But she thought it would be fun to do that. So there was this sort of massive career change. They decided to buy a cottage resort trailer park near Bobcaygeon called Green Acres. And they bought that in 1966 and when I was 11. And so it was this sort of massive upheaval change in our lives to be running this thing. And I think my dad did it for my mom because he said to me one time, it's where the title of the book came from. He said, here I was. I think we were looking at, even at the camp we had some framed art director awards that my dad had won and were up on the wall. And he said, I used to do all this kind of stuff. And here now I'm running a fish camp. He said, this place is my last resort. So I don't think he was ever really happy about it, but he did it. And he was very handy and he could build docks. He could do anything. My dad and I would build docks together and put them in the lake and stuff. But just as I was turning 16, my dad, who was only 59, was diagnosed with lung cancer. And so I think the diagnosis was in something like March. And I got my driver's license that month. And he had surgery, I think, very soon after that. And by November, he was dead.
Wow.
And I took over kind of basically, I was the man of the house. I mean, I had an older brother, 11 years older than me. But he had his own problems. He was suffering from schizophrenia. He'd had a lot of difficult things going on for him. So it was me, and I basically took over running this fishing camp.
It's so much for a young person to be dealing with, and I can kind of only imagine because I lost a parent quite young as well, but I was a bit older and also did not have to run a fishing camp at the time. How did you balance, you're 16 years old, you're running this fishing camp, you're also someone who has creative impulses, and you're looking at going to university, studying English, and grieving. How did you navigate all of that happening at once?
It's funny. I think that you don't appreciate until some time has gone by and you look back and then you think, how did I get through that? Because it was really tough. I think one thing that really helped was running Green Acres. I had a really great support system of all these guests who came up. There were people who parked their trailers there for the whole summer. And they were very close and they were very supportive. And there were people like a fellow named Phil Adams, who was, a North York building inspector. And he would come up every weekend with his wife and, he'd help me fix broken pipes. And we'd do this and then do that. And we'd hang out. And I had all these kind of, substitute father figures, one of whom was a guy who came up every year for 2 weeks and stayed there, who was a private detective from Buffalo. I had to go get my eyes checked, and I had to drive all the way to Peterborough, and I couldn't drive back because my eyes would
they'd be dilated, whatever. Yeah.
So he came with me, and he would tell me about cases he'd been on and so forth. And so there was this kind of a network that helped me, but I can't say it was easy. It was really tough. But when you're 16, this is your life. This is what you're going through, and I guess this is everybody's got problems, and these are mine.
Linwood, as I mentioned, you did go on to study English in university. You went to Trent, and Margaret Lawrence was the writer in residence when you were there, a giant of Canadian literature. Yep. And she actually looked at some of your early writing. Can you tell us about your dynamic with her?
She was such a good friend and a mentor and encouraging. So when I got to Trent, And she was going to be there for 2 sort of sessions. She was there for sort of the spring of one year and the fall of the next. And all I had ever read of hers was, I think, 1 short story when I was in high school. But I thought, well, here's someone who makes a living as a writer. And so I took her what I was writing then. I had my fan fiction had sort of progressed. So now I was writing my own versions of Columbo stories or, something like that. And I took stuff, for her to read because that's what she was doing. And she read it. We had these lovely chats and so forth. And then over the summer, I read everything that she had done up to that point. She hadn't written The Diviners yet. And when I went back to see her in the fall, I said, I felt badly. You were reading all of my stuff. I hadn't read any of yours. And I read it all over the summer. It's pretty good. But she was wonderful. And she was so supportive. And then once, I met Neetha, who would become my wife, and everybody loves Neetha. And so we would go up and see her, and they would chat, and they would have a lovely time. And she was super encouraging. And as the relationship progressed, I wrote 3 actual novels in my early 20s that were never published, and we can all be grateful, I guess, for that. But she read those, and she would write letters to publishers on my behalf. And when she was going through a terrible period where, the local Board of Education where they was teaching her book, there were people that were opposed to it, and because it had a few foul words or because it explored, so a woman's young sexuality and so forth, that's being The Diviners, they were branding her book as pornography, and she was going through all these terrible things. And she even asked us one time to go into the local church to hear what they had to say about her one Sunday morning, and it was awful. But she was a really important figure in my life, and she was kind of larger than life. There was something about her that she had this quality that just was, I don't know, there was kind of an aura about her. And we miss her, you know?
Yeah, I know she wouldn't have lived to see you become this novelist who did get published. She was sending your work out to publishers, but you were like a newspaper man, I think, still when she would have passed, right?
Well, we became friends when I was at university, and then my first job was at the Peterborough Examiner. I would go out and cover some big fire, and the front page of the Examiner would be a story of mine, and phone would ring that evening, and it would be her saying, "Hey, kiddo, way to go," and so forth. We were still friends by the time I got to the Toronto Star. And I believe it was 1986 when she passed away. I joined the Star in 81. But she never saw me become a writer of any kind. Mm-hmm. But I think what was important to me was that when I was young, someone like Margaret Lawrence and also Ross MacDonald, who wrote the Lou Archer novels, both took an interest and were supportive. And maybe I wasn't ready yet, and I clearly wasn't. But I think maybe they saw that I had prospects, that I had some possibilities.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up Ross MacDonald because I did want to ask about him as well. Ross MacDonald is the pen name of Kenneth Miller, and he was famous for these Lou Archer detective novels. Right. So another kind of dip into the world of detective procedurals that seem to have been quite inspiring for you from a young age. I've read that you discovered him when you were 15, by which point you were already a voracious reader. You were writing your Man from U.N.C.L.E. fan fiction. Yeah. But what was it about Ross MacDonald's novels that stood out for you? Yeah,
it's funny. My bookstore was the twirling, squeaky metal paperback rack at the IGA grocery store in Bobcaygeon. And I saw one day there was a paperback of The Goodbye Look, his novel, and it said at the top, there was a blurb from the New York Times, which was actually a William Goldman review, and said, "The finest series of detective novels ever written by an American." I thought, well, I want to read that. And the other thing I loved about it was, if you can believe this, the font that was used on the cover for the title and his name was the same font that was used throughout all the Man from U.N.C.L.E. movies and TV shows. They used the same font. And I thought, well, I love that font, so it's got to be a good book, right? And then I just started devouring all of them. I just started reading all of them. What I liked about them, I guess, and this is kind of in retrospect looking back, but I think what appealed to me was this was a writer who was taking the conventions of the detective novel and doing something with it. And it was social commentary. There was corruption of wealth, environmentalism. There were all these things that Kenneth Miller cared about. And he thought, I can bring these to an audience and make my point, but I can do it in the context of a mystery so I can entertain you as well. And maybe at the time it wasn't quite as obvious to me just how incredibly dysfunctional my own family was, but to read about other dysfunctional families was very satisfying.
Well, speaking of dysfunctional families, Linwood, I want to talk about No Time for Goodbye, which was your big breakout book. And it was this sort of dark domestic thriller, which was a bit of a change from the more comedic books that you wrote with your first series, starting with Bad Move. No Time for Goodbye is about this 14-year-old girl who wakes up and finds that her family has vanished. How did that book change your life and your writing career?
Wow, did it ever. So I had written 4 novels about Zach, 4 sort of comic thrillers. And, I like to say that collectively they sold about 90 copies or so. And so my agent had said, you can keep doing these, but it might be wise to think, stop writing funny, write a, quote, big thriller. And so you just need a great hook, great idea. And so I would send her an idea in an email, and she'd say, I've read that before. And I'd send another idea, and she'd say, yeah, I don't know. And then one morning at 5, I wake up, and this idea is just there about a girl who wakes up one morning, and sometime in the night her family has disappeared, and she doesn't know, were they all murdered and somehow the killers missed her, or did they decide to leave and not take her with them? And which would be worse? So I sent an email to my agent at 8:30 in the morning and said, what about this? And she called immediately. She said, that's it. That is the greatest hook for a thriller. She said, what happened to the family? And I said, I have no idea.
I'll work on that for you, yeah.
She says, that's okay. You'll figure that out.
Yeah.
So, I had kind of low expectations. I wrote the book. We sent it out. And once we had sent it out, suddenly we got a bigger deal in the U.S. Suddenly it was picked up in Germany. It was picked up in the U.K. And in the summer of 2008, it was picked by a show in England that was kind of like getting picked as an Oprah book, but it was Richard and Judy, and they picked it. And No Time for Goodbye became the fastest-selling book of that show's sort of book club and finished out that year as the top-selling novel of the year in the UK. So that's when I thought, maybe I can quit the day job.
What do you think it was about that book in particular that seemed to resonate with readers?
The book started selling like crazy even before anybody knew what it was about. But I think that book touched into a kind of primal fear that we have, which is of losing our family. So it tapped into something. And so it worked on people on a real emotional level. That's the only way I can explain it. Other than that, and it's just sometimes I think it's in this business, it's just pure luck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of losing family disappearing out of nowhere, the possibility or lack thereof of bringing them back or finding them, that's the foundation of No Time for Goodbye. But it's a theme that has come up in a number of your novels. What is it that you personally find compelling about this idea? What keeps you going back to that?
Well, it's funny. I have a friend who used to work at the Star named Richard Azuni, and he was interviewing me one time, and he said, do you think this all goes back to losing your dad at 16? And I was like, whoa, that's maybe something there. I don't know. But I think that when you write a thriller, there has to be something big at stake, or it's not worth reading. It has to be compulsively readable. And so it's got to be something big at stake. And what is that? That's a loved one. That's maybe your reputation, maybe you've been framed or whatever, you're trying to get yourself out from under. But to me, there's no greater thing of importance than a family member, and there's no higher stakes than that. And so that's what I think keeps coming back in the books.
Your most recent novel, I Will Ruin You, is also somewhat of a family story from what I understand, but it opens with this disgruntled student who comes back to his school with a bomb strapped to his chest. And the book peels back the layers to show what has happened to push him to this point. How did you build that story in particular?
Well, it's funny that a lot of times books start off in one direction and then they end up being something else by the time you're done. What really was at the core of that book, and it had nothing to do with this student coming to seek vengeance on some staff members. I had an idea for a plot angle, which was what if there was someone who was threatening a family's security through whatever, blackmail, and he ended up dead. And the husband thought his wife did it, and the wife thought the husband did it. And they can't really talk to each other. That was kind of where that book started. And then it just became something else. And I had to think about, well, what if there were an allegation against somebody that was or was not true? And this individual achieved some notoriety by foiling an attack on a school. Someone saw him and thought, oh, you think you're the big hero now. Well, I know something about you that nobody else does. And that was where that book started going. But as often is the case, if you have an axe to grind, you can sometimes find a way to do it in a book. And some of that book is about book banning and parents outraged that certain things are being taught in a classroom and this teacher getting in trouble for that. So you can find sometimes ways to sneak stuff into a book that's on your mind.
This is the second time now, actually, that book banning has come up in our conversation, because you mentioned earlier we were talking about Margaret Lawrence and some of her work having been challenged, and now you're kind of doing this sneaky commentary, and I will ruin you, about book banning. Has your work ever been challenged? Like, where do you come to this topic? Is it just you're a concerned citizen like perhaps I am? Or is this something that you've confronted actually in your career at all?
I have to say I'm somewhat offended sometimes that none of my books have been banned anywhere. I think that's really sometimes the best thing that can happen to you, is that people are outraged by what you've done, so it should be taken off the market. But as a subject, it outrages me. What we're going through now, I find, is this kind of celebration of ignorance, of keeping people from knowing things. The stupider that we can keep the population, the more that we can get away with. And book banning is just one aspect of all of that. So it's an issue that drives me crazy. And I love that places like Penn Can and others, they're fighting this fight. That's one of the reasons why I put that into that book.
It's an interesting time to be talking about book banning, because I feel like this turn towards ignorance and information being purged, even outside the world of the literary, like you read about all these like website takedowns that are happening in the United States where government data is just being erased en masse. Mm-hmm. What do you think the responsibility is of the writer, even for somebody who's working in genre and whose work, maybe, as you said, your work hasn't been banned anywhere, maybe you're not seen as political. What do you feel? Yeah, there's always time. Hey, maybe the next one will get banned. We'll see. But what do you feel your responsibility is, I suppose, as somebody who's writing and engaging publicly in this way?
I think it's always to point out the hypocrisies, to point out the things that people need to be reminded of, to point out that these people are saying one thing but they're doing another. That responsibility never ends. And if I can have some small role to play in that, I'll do it.
Well, Linwood, we're talking a bit about your forthcoming novel, which is Whistle, and this is your first supernatural thriller. The present-day through line that we see is this mother, Annie, and her son, Charlie, who find this mysterious train set, and then some very disturbing events begin to unfold. It's interesting that you're turning to the supernatural after having written, 20-plus novels not engaging in that space. What drew you to this genre at this moment?
I've liked reading it. I'm not a wide reader in the genre, but I've always been a fan of Stephen King's work. And I had an idea probably 20 years ago that was related to Whistle, although at the time the book that I had in mind, it had no kind of supernatural aspect. But I'd been thinking about the book for a long time. And of course, full confession, I'm a model train nerd. And I thought, well, it's just not fair that dolls like Chucky or the rocking horse from the Rocking Horse Winner or little wind-up monkey toys, that they get to be evil. Why can't trains be evil? And I thought, well, but can you pull it off and be convincing? Can you make a toy train scary? And I thought, well, how am I going to go at this? And I came up with the idea of a story about a woman named Annie. He has a son named Charlie. They've had a kind of double tragedy. She writes children's books, and one of her books prompted or inspired a child to do something that ended up costing him his life. And then to add on to that, she's lost her husband. And so she and Charlie decide to get away, get out of the city, get a place in the country for the summer. And Charlie finds this box locked away in a shed behind a place that has these toy trains in it. And now we're hearing whistles in the night, or we're hearing trains that aren't there, and very bad things start to happen, and they all are tied into something that happened in a small town not too far away more than 20 years ago.
You mentioned earlier that your father was a bit of a model train head himself. I guess I'm interested to know more about your relationship with toy trains, though, because you're quite a big fan of model railroads. Yeah. Tell me about that. Like, how much of a model train head are you? Oh,
I'm just ridiculous. It all goes back when I was about, 4 or 5 or whatever. My dad made me a very basic kind of train set. And it grew. It was on a 4x8 sheet, and then another 4x8 sheet got attached to it. And it was always fun. I liked it. And then it was slot cars, and it was just ridiculous. And then, then I left home, and we had apartments and, small houses. And then finally, when Nathan and I, when we had our first house, I thought, I'm going to build a model railway. And so every house that we have been in since the 80s, first the people go into houses first and they think, well, is it a nice kitchen? And I'm going right to the basement going, is there a room where I can put up a layout? What can I do? And so I've just always liked building them. I like doing it. And I think that one way it serves me well now is, you spend your entire day staring at a computer screen, imagining a world in your head and putting it on that screen. But a great way to decompress from that is to build one with your hands. And sometimes that's one of the best things. Like if I'm stuck on a plot point, I can go downstairs and I can just run trains, stand in the middle of it and have them going around and around. You know, a few years ago, a lovely guy from the Globe, Mark Medley, interviewed me, and he came in downstairs and he stood in the middle of the room with the trains going around, and he said, I kind of get it. It's kind of Zen-like. And it is a way to kind of transport your mind somewhere else. And so I've always liked it. And, you know, our son, he got the bug from me, and he ended up building all sorts of miniatures for Little Canada, the exhibits.
No way.
Right down at Yonge and Dundas. He did a ton of work for them, and he's got his own business now doing miniatures and making little props and things like that. So, I mean, he caught the bug from me. I don't know, there's something very satisfying about it. It seems terribly nerdly, and so I'm always desperate to point out, well, hey, you know, Rod Stewart has a huge model railway, and Frank Sinatra did, and so, I mean, we're not all crazy.
I mean, I found it interesting reading about model railways. I had not thought about model railways in a long time, but I actually recalled, like, my dad definitely had one that then subsequently got boxed up when he got too neurotic about, are the kids going to ruin the model railway or something? According to my mom, it's in storage somewhere, though. I don't know. Maybe one day when I live in a bigger place, I'll break it out and get into trains. I am curious, though. You're talking about you find building model railways very zen. It's this thing that's been a link between first you and your father, now you and your son. Why would you want to turn something that is such a source of joy for you into something evil in Whistle?
Well, because it's just so delightful. And it's also it's also a bond now between me and my 2-year-old grandson for when he comes over. And it's just so cool to see him in there loving the trains. But I just think why not? You know, like I'm sure that whoever invented or came up with the idea for Chucky liked dolls too, but thought, why can't we just make them evil? I don't know. Maybe it's my perverted way of looking at everything, but I think when you've made a career out of taking ordinary situations and turning them into jeopardy, it's even more fun to take something that's a source of pleasure and fun and turn it into something that you'll never look at again the same way. It was kind of like I did a book a few years ago called Elevator Pitch, which was about a different kind of serial killer who was dispatching his victims by sabotaging elevators at random throughout the city. And other people writing to me saying, I can't take an elevator anymore. And I thought, there's no higher praise, really, to scare people to that degree.
You know, and I think that your work does seem to have that effect on people because before we sat down and started recording, I was telling you that my mom a couple years ago had read Look Both Ways, which is your self-driving cars book. I am somebody who already is afraid of self-driving cars, and just her describing the plot of the book to me made me not feel very good about the prospect of more self-driving cars being on the road, I have to say.
It's funny, you know, Look Both Ways, which was, as you say, about a test community where everybody surrenders their car from this island, their regular car, and they get a self-driving car. And then a virus is introduced into the system, and all the cars essentially become homicidal. It'd be like being on an island with 700 Christines. And that book was a departure for me, and Whistle is a departure for me. And I think those two books, I had more fun writing those two books than any of the others.
Why do you think that is, that you had more fun?
I don't know. I think they were sort of liberating. You know, I could have fun. I could do things that weren't entirely believable. You know, and when you write a thriller with a complex plot, it has to work. You can't sort of jam a square peg into a round hole, to use that cliche, to make the plot work. It has to, if this is a cliche, it has to be organic. It has to be believable. And then you do a book like Look Both Ways or Whistle, and you think, okay, this has to be logical in the context of that world, but I can still get away with more. I can do different things. I can have people talk to dead people. I can have cars running people down on purpose with no driver. I could do anything I want. And that's part of why I think those books were just so much fun to write.
Do you think that sense of having freedom to maybe create plots that aren't believable in the sense that you literally think it could happen in the real world, but are believable emotionally, is that something that you feel you've come to perhaps because you're further along in your career? Like, why do you feel now you're able to write these kinds of stories? Maybe
they're just the ideas that I had that were sort of slanted in that direction weren't well enough formed yet. Or maybe I felt I just needed to get all these other ones under my belt to know that now I can take a chance. And maybe people who will read Whistle and think, I don't know, this is too different from his other stuff. And then others may think, wow, this is like the best thing. I feel like Whistle's the best book I've ever done. I just had so much fun doing it.
Wow. If you can cast your mind back in time a little bit to young Linwood, who was banging out what we would call fan fiction, on a typewriter that your dad had taught you to use. If he could see the career that you've had as a writer, what do you think he would make of it?
He would be stunned. He would be really stunned. And I mean, when I was writing all those stories as a kid, who was I writing them for? Nobody's reading them. I read them for my own pleasure. I mean, maybe my parents might have read one or two of them. I don't know. But I was just writing them for me and had no dream that anybody beyond me would read these books. And so I still consider myself very, very fortunate, very blessed that I'm able now to make a living at what I really had always wanted to do. I mean, when I was 15, 16, 17, and into my early 20s, I wanted to be Ross MacDonald. And when I spent an evening with him, when he came to Canada, I was, working at the camp burying fish guts, and I get a call that Ross MacDonald or Kenneth Miller is in Peterborough, and did I want to have dinner with him and his writer wife, Margaret Miller? And I was like, I think yes. And he wrote in my hardback copy of his novel, Sleeping Beauty, May 1st, 1976, for Linwood, who will, I hope, someday outright me.
Wow.
Signed, Ross MacDonald. And I still get chills that happened.
Linwood, I have had so much fun chatting with you today. Thank you so much for coming in.
This has been such a huge pleasure. Thank you so much.
Linwood Barclay is the author of Whistle. It comes out this May. And you'll also hear Linwood this week on Canada Reads 2025. He's the champion for Jenny's Boy by Wayne Johnston, and he'll be spending the next week convincing 4 other panelists why Jenny's Boy is the book that all of Canada should read. Canada Reads is airing from March 17th to 20th. You can watch it on CBC Gem or tune in on the radio or wherever you get your podcasts. And everything you need to know about the show can be found at cbcbooks.ca. This week's show was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Barb Carey. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and to the entire CBC Books team, who bring you all the goods on social and on our website. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. New episodes drop on Sundays and Wednesdays. And make sure to hit the follow button so you can keep up with all the excellent guests we've got coming up on the show. And don't forget to leave us a review. It helps us spread the word to others who might enjoy the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.